Thomas Webb always sat in the back row of the lecture hall. At 25, he was older than most undergraduate students, and his quiet demeanor made him practically invisible. He preferred it that way. Lost in the pages of his notebook, Thomas rarely looked up until that Tuesday afternoon when Professor Eleanor Blackwood stepped into the auditorium. At 75, Eleanor commanded attention without asking for it. Her silver hair was pulled into an elegant chignon, and despite her age, she moved with remarkable grace. She was a visiting professor, a renowned literary scholar giving a special lecture on contemporary poetry. Poetry, she began, her voice clear and confident, is not just about beautiful words. It's about finding meaning in the spaces between those words. Thomas found himself looking up from his notebook. For the first time in months, someone had managed to capture his full attention. When the lecture ended, students rushed out, but Thomas lingered, watching as Eleanor gathered her notes. He approached her desk hesitantly. "Professor Blackwood," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Your interpretation of Elizabeth Bishop's work was illuminating." Eleanor looked up, studying him with piercing blue eyes. "You're the one who never looked away during the entire lecture." Thomas felt his cheeks flush. "I found it impossible to look away." A small smile formed on Eleanor's lips. "What's your name, young man?" "Thomas. Thomas Webb." "Well, Thomas Webb, would you care to continue this conversation over tea?" As they walked across campus together, whispers followed them. The quiet, solitary student and the distinguished elderly professor. An odd pair indeed. But for the first time in years, Thomas didn't care what others thought. In the cafe, surrounded by shelves of books, they talked for hours. Not just about poetry, but about life, dreams, disappointments. Thomas found himself sharing things he'd never told anyone. Eleanor listened with genuine interest. "You have an old soul, Thomas," she said finally. "Perhaps that's why you find it difficult to connect with people your age." As evening fell, Thomas realized he had just experienced the most honest conversation of his adult life, with a woman 3 times his age whom he'd just met. What he didn't see was Eleanor leaning against a wall after he left, pressing a handkerchief to her mouth as a coughing fit overtook her, or the way her hand trembled as she reached for the pill bottle in her purse. For the next few weeks, Thomas and Eleanor met regularly. Their Wednesday afternoon teas became the highlight of Thomas's week. They discussed books they loved, places they dreamed of visiting, and films that had moved them. But Thomas couldn't help noticing that something was changing in Eleanor. Though her mind remained sharp as ever, physically she seemed to be growing frailer. On a rainy Wednesday in late October, Eleanor didn't show up at their usual cafe. Thomas waited for an hour, concern growing with each passing minute. Finally, he did something he'd never done before. He went to her faculty office. The department secretary looked surprised. "Professor Blackwood called in sick today. She hasn't done that since she arrived." Thomas hesitated before asking, "Do you have her address? I have some important papers to drop off." It was a lie, but his worry overshadowed his guilt. 20 minutes later, he stood outside an elegant brownstone in the historic part of town. Eleanor answered on the 3rd knock, looking pale and tired, in a silk robe. "Thomas," she said, genuine surprise in her voice. "How did you find me?" "I was worried," he admitted. "You've never missed our Wednesday before." Something in Eleanor's expression softened. She stepped aside to let him in. "I suppose it's time I told you the truth anyway." Eleanor sat across from him, took a deep breath, and said, "I have pancreatic cancer, Thomas. Stage 4. I've known for 3 months." The words hit Thomas like a physical blow. "But there must be treatments, surgeries." Eleanor shook her head. "I've seen the best specialists. At my age, with how advanced it is, they've given me 4 to 6 months. I've decided against chemotherapy." Thomas stared at his untouched Brandy, struggling to process her words. "Why didn't you tell me?" "I didn't want our friendship to be overshadowed by my illness," she said simply. "Those Wednesday afternoons, they've been pure joy." Eleanor reached for a leather-bound journal on the coffee table. I made a list, you see. Things I've always wanted to do but never found the time for. My bucket list, as they say. She handed it to Thomas, who opened it carefully. The pages were filled with Eleanor's elegant handwriting, items crossed off, others still waiting. The next item is to visit the house where I grew up in Rhode Island. I haven't been back in 50 years. Would you come with me this weekend? In that moment, Thomas realized he would follow this extraordinary woman anywhere. Just tell me what time to pick you up. What he couldn't know was that Eleanor watched him from her window, making a decision that would change both their lives forever. The journey to Rhode Island. The following weekend marked the beginning of a new chapter in their unusual friendship. Eleanor dozed for much of the drive, occasionally waking to point out landmarks from her childhood or recite poems that the passing scenery brought to mind. They arrived at sunset. The house, a Victorian beauty overlooking the Atlantic, had been converted into a bed and breakfast years ago. Eleanor stood on the sidewalk, gazing up at it with an expression Thomas couldn't quite read. "It seems smaller," she said finally. At dinner in the B&B's small dining room, Eleanor was more animated than Thomas had ever seen her. She told stories of her childhood, running wild through the gardens, sneaking down to the beach against her parents' wishes, reading under the willow tree that still stood in the backyard. "Would you like to see it?" she asked after dessert. "The tree, I mean. It's dark, but the moon is bright enough." They walked through the garden together, Eleanor leading the way with surprising certainty for someone who hadn't been there in half a century. The willow tree was enormous now, its branches creating a curtained sanctuary beneath. "I used to hide here when I wanted to escape the world," Eleanor said, running her hand along the trunk. "It was here I decided to become a writer, to study literature. It was here I had my first kiss. I've made another important decision here tonight," she said, opening her eyes to look at him directly. "Thomas, I'd like to propose something unconventional, something that might shock you." Thomas felt an inexplicable tightening in his chest. "Go on." "I'd like you to marry me." Of all the things he might have expected, this wasn't one of them. "Eleanor, She held up a hand. "Let me explain, before you answer. This isn't a romantic proposal. I have no children, no close family. My estate is considerable. When I die, everything will go to distant cousins who never visit, or to the University Foundation." She stepped closer. "I've watched you these past weeks, Thomas. You have a genuine love for literature, a brilliant mind, and a kind heart. You told me once about your dream to open an independent bookstore someday. I want to leave my estate to someone who will honor my legacy, who will use it to promote the love of literature. Someone like you. All it requires is a marriage certificate and a few signatures." Thomas stared at her, speechless. "People will talk, Eleanor. They'll say terrible things about both of us." She smiled sadly. "I'll be dead soon, Thomas. What? Do I care for gossip? And you've always stood apart from others anyway." Thomas thought of his tiny apartment, his student loans, the decades it would take to save enough for a bookstore of his own. Then he thought of Eleanor facing her final months alone. "It's not about the money," he said finally. "You know that, right?" Eleanor's expression softened. "I know. That's precisely why I'm asking you." Under the same willow tree where Eleanor had made all her important decisions, Thomas made his. "Yes," he said simply. "I'll marry you, Eleanor." They were married the following Friday in a civil ceremony at City Hall. Eleanor wore a simple gray silk dress with a pearl necklace. Thomas, a navy suit he'd purchased for the occasion. The only witnesses were Eleanor's longtime lawyer, Mr. Abernathy, and his assistant. The paperwork was signed and filed within the hour. By afternoon, Thomas had moved his few possessions into Eleanor's guest bedroom. By evening, word had somehow spread across campus. Thomas's phone buzzed continuously, with text messages from classmates he barely knew. "Dude, did you seriously marry old Professor Blackwood? Gold digger much? UTF Webb, how desperate are you?" He turned off his phone. Eleanor handled the situation with characteristic grace. When the department chair called, clearly uncomfortable, she simply said, "Yes, I've married. No, it's not." Joke? Yes, I'll still be finishing the semester, and no, it's none of your business. The real blow came 3 days after the wedding when Thomas's academic advisor called him into his office. "I've always thought you were a serious student, Webb," Professor Martin said, disappointment evident in his voice. "What you do in your personal life is your business, but this spectacle reflects poorly on the department." "It's not a spectacle," Thomas said quietly. "It's a private matter between two adults." "She's dying," Martin said bluntly. "Everyone knows it, and you've positioned yourself to inherit from a woman 3 times your age after knowing her for what? A month? It looks exactly like what people are saying it is." Thomas felt a flash of anger. "And what are they saying?" "That you're taking advantage of a vulnerable old woman. That you're nothing but a fortune hunter." Thomas stood up. "Eleanor is the least vulnerable person I've ever met, and I don't care what people think." But he did care. It hurt to walk across campus and feel eyes following him, to hear whispers cut off when he entered a room. At home, Eleanor noticed his mood. "Are you regretting our arrangement?" she asked that evening as they sat in her library. She had been teaching him to play chess, another item on her list. "No," Thomas said honestly. "I just didn't expect it to affect me like this. The judgment." Eleanor moved her knight. "People fear what they don't understand, and they especially fear relationships that don't fit into neat categories." As the days passed, they settled into a routine. Mornings, they took breakfast together. Then Eleanor worked on her final academic paper, while Thomas attended classes. Evenings, they worked through items on Eleanor's list. On the 10th day after their wedding, Thomas returned home early, having canceled lunch with a former friend who'd wanted to talk some sense into him. He found Eleanor napping in her favorite armchair, a book open on her lap. As he placed a blanket over her, he noticed a stack of mail on the side table. Quietly, he sorted through it. At the bottom was a cream-colored envelope addressed in unfamiliar handwriting. Thomas placed it on top of the pile where Eleanor would see it, then went to prepare tea. He didn't notice the return address from a small town in France, or the slight tremor in Eleanor's hand when she discovered it later. The days leading up to the letter had been among the most peaceful of Thomas's life. Despite the whispers and judgment from the outside world, inside Eleanor's home, their home now, they created a sanctuary of shared interests and quiet companionship. Eleanor approached her bucket list with methodical enthusiasm. Each morning, she would announce the day's adventure over breakfast. "Today," she might say, "we're going to learn to make authentic pasta from Mrs. Ricci." Mrs. Ricci, it turned out, was an octogenarian who had once been Eleanor's neighbor, and who spent 3 hours teaching them to make pasta by hand, all while telling scandalous stories about Eleanor's youth that made Thomas laugh until his sides ached. Or she might declare, "This afternoon we're going dancing." Thomas had protested that one. "I don't dance," he'd insisted. "Neither do I anymore," Eleanor had replied with a twinkle in her eyes. "But watching others dance brings me joy." They'd spent that evening at a swing dance club, sipping old-fashioned cocktails while young couples twirled around the floor. To Thomas's surprise, an elderly gentleman had approached their table and asked Eleanor to dance. Nathan was a magnificent dancer in his youth, she'd explained after declining politely. "We attended the same summer program at Oxford in 1970. "You knew him that long ago?" Thomas had asked, surprised. A shadow had crossed Eleanor's face. "We lost touch shortly after. Life took us in different directions." It was the only time Thomas had seen her look regretful about the past. On the morning of the 10th day, Thomas had awakened feeling strangely content. The situation was objectively bizarre. He was married to a dying woman, old enough to be his grandmother, ostracized by his peers, and living a life he could never have imagined months earlier. Yet he felt more at peace than he had in years. That was when he'd returned home to find her napping, when he'd sorted through the mail and placed the cream-colored envelope on top of the pile. He'd gone to the kitchen to prepare Earl Grey tea, Eleanor's favorite. unaware that the letter would shatter the delicate happiness they'd built. Later, he would look back on those 10 days as a strange, beautiful dream. A pause between the life he'd been living and the one that awaited him after the letter changed everything. Thomas was in the kitchen preparing dinner when he heard it. A sound he'd never heard from Eleanor before. A sob, raw and unrestrained, coming from the library. He found her sitting at her desk, the cream-colored envelope open before her. A single sheet of paper clutched in trembling hands. Tears streamed down her face. "Eleanor?" Thomas approached cautiously. "What's wrong?" She looked up, seemingly disoriented, as if she'd forgotten he lived there too. "He's alive," she whispered. "All this time, he's been alive." Thomas gently took the letter from her hands. The handwriting was elegant but slightly shaky, as if written by an elderly person. It was dated 2 weeks earlier from a town in southern France he'd never heard of. "My dearest Ellie, if you're reading this, then my letter has found you at last. I've written so many over the years, sent to universities where I thought you might be teaching, but never received a reply. Perhaps they never reached you. Perhaps you chose not to respond. I would understand. Either. I recently saw your name in a literary journal and learned you're teaching at Westfield this semester. After all this time, knowing where you are feels like a miracle. I'm alive, Ellie. I survived that night, though barely. The official story that I died in the fire was convenient for everyone involved. I've spent the past 43 years in exile, first in Germany, then France. I built a quiet life teaching literature at a small university here. I never married. How could I when my heart remained with you? I'm returning to the States next month. My doctors have given me a diagnosis that makes me brave enough to reach out after all these years. I would very much like to see you before it's too late for both of us. With all my love." Still, Nathan Thomas looked up from the letter to find Eleanor watching him, her expression unreadable. "Who is Nathan?" he asked softly. Eleanor took a deep breath, composing herself with visible effort. "Nathan Winters is a poet. We met at Oxford during a summer program in 1970. I was 21, he was 24. She paused. "He was also the great love of my life." Thomas sat down across from her. "What happened?" Eleanor's eyes grew distant. It was a different time. Nathan's poetry was political, controversial. He spoke out against the Vietnam War, against government surveillance. We were both idealistic, passionate. She stood and walked to the window, looking out at the garden now illuminated by streetlights. Then came the threats. His publisher dropped him. The university where he taught questioned his contract renewal. We started noticing men following us. Thomas felt a chill. "You were being watched?" Eleanor nodded. "One night there was a fire at Nathan's apartment building. 2 people died. Nathan's body was supposedly identified as one of them." Her voice broke. "I was told he died because of his associations, because of people like me." "And you believed?" "He was dead for 43 years. There was a funeral, Thomas. I saw a body, badly burned but with his ring, his watch." She closed her eyes. "I've lived most of my life with that image in my mind, with the guilt of thinking I somehow contributed to his death." Thomas tried to process what he was hearing, and now he's alive, and coming here. "Yes," Eleanor turned back to him. "He's coming here in 3 days. And like me, he's dying." "Will you see him?" Thomas asked, though he already knew the answer. "I have to," Eleanor said simply. "Wouldn't you, in my position?" Eleanor crossed the room and took his hands in hers. "Thomas, I need to ask you something important. Our arrangement, our marriage, it was based on certain assumptions. This changes things." "Are you saying you want to end our marriage?" Thomas asked, surprised by the pang he felt at the thought. "No," Eleanor said quickly, "but I need to know that you understand this complicates matters. Nathan and I, there's unfinished business between us." Thomas squeezed her hands. "Eleanor, I married you to help fulfill your final wishes. If seeing Nathan is one of them, then I support that completely." Relief flooded her face. Thank you. For the next 2 days, Eleanor was a bundle of nervous energy. She rearranged books on shelves that had been organized the same way for years. She ordered fresh flowers for every room. She tried on and discarded a dozen outfits, finally settling on a simple blue dress that Thomas thought made her look both elegant and approachable. On the evening before Nathan's arrival, Eleanor asked Thomas to build a fire in the library fireplace. It was unseasonably cold for November, and the old brownstone was drafty. They sat before the flames, sharing a bottle of red wine. "Tell me about him," Thomas said, refilling her glass. "The Nathan you knew then." Eleanor's expression softened in the firelight. He was brilliant, not in the academic way that universities reward, but in a raw, intuitive way. He could read a poem once and understand it on levels others missed after years of study. She took a sip of wine. He was also infuriating, stubborn, convinced he was right about everything. "Sounds familiar," Thomas teased. Eleanor shot him a look, but her eyes were smiling. He cared deeply about justice, real justice, not just the abstract concept. He believed poetry could change minds, which could change hearts, which could change the world. "You loved him very much," Thomas observed. "More than I've ever admitted to myself," Eleanor confessed. "After I thought he died, I threw myself into academics. I told myself it was because I was focused on my career. But really," she trailed off. "You were punishing yourself," Thomas finished for her. Eleanor nodded. "For not being brave enough to go with him that night. For choosing safety over love." She looked at Thomas directly. "Do you know what the worst part is? I built this whole distinguished career, and in my most honest moments, I know Nathan would have hated much of it." "There's something I need to tell you about tomorrow," Eleanor said finally. "When Nathan arrives, I'd like to see him alone at first." Thomas nodded. "Of course. I can make myself scarce for the day." "No," Eleanor said quickly. "I'd like you nearby, but there are things we need to say to each other that should be private." She hesitated. "He doesn't know I'm married." "I'll tell him, of course, but I'd like to explain our arrangement myself." "I understand," Thomas said, though he felt a strange twist of unease. What would this man from Eleanor's past think of their unconventional marriage? That night, Thomas lay awake in the guest room that had become his bedroom, thinking about the man who would arrive tomorrow. The great love of Eleanor's life, presumed dead for decades, now returning just as she herself was preparing to leave this world. He wondered what Nathan Winters looked like now. Would there be any trace left of the passionate young poet who had captured Eleanor's heart? Would he and Eleanor reconnect as if the decades had never passed? Or would they be strangers to each other now? Most of all, Thomas wondered where he fit into this unfolding story. He hadn't expected to care for her as deeply as he now did, and he certainly hadn't expected to find himself in the middle of a love story that had been interrupted nearly half a century ago. Nathan Winters arrived precisely at 2 o'clock the following afternoon. Thomas, watching discreetly from the upstairs window, saw a taxi pull up and an elderly man emerge. He leaned heavily on a cane, and his white hair was thin, but he moved with deliberate dignity. He wore a tweed jacket with leather elbow patches and carried a small bouquet of wildflowers. Nothing fancy from a florist, but the kind one might pick from a roadside. Thomas had promised Eleanor he would remain upstairs until she called for him. He heard the doorbell, heard Eleanor's footsteps in the hallway, heard the door open. Then silence. Downstairs, Eleanor stood frozen in the doorway. The man before her was both a stranger and achingly familiar. The dark hair was now white, the strong face lined with age, the tall frame slightly stooped. But the eyes, those remarkable green eyes, were unchanged. "Ellie," Nathan said, his voice rougher but with the same cadence she remembered. "You're still beautiful." Eleanor felt tears threatening. "And you're still a liar," she replied, falling, back on the teasing tone they'd once shared so naturally. Nathan smiled, And suddenly she could see the young man she'd loved superimposed over this older version. "Only about the important things," he said, handing her the wildflowers. "I remembered you never cared for roses." "You remembered correctly." Eleanor stepped back. "Please come in." In the library, with tea served and initial awkwardness beginning to fade, they studied each other, taking in the changes that time had wrought. "I thought you were dead," Eleanor said finally, her voice steady despite the emotions churning inside her. "I saw your body. They showed me your ring, your watch." Nathan's expression darkened. "They wanted you to believe that. Easier to control you if you thought I was gone." He leaned forward. "I was badly injured in the fire, burn, smoke inhalation. When I regained consciousness, I was in a private facility. A man explained that I had a choice: disappear forever or face charges that would put me away for decades." "So you chose exile," she said softly. "I chose life," he corrected. "And I chose to protect you. They made it clear that if I contacted you, you'd face the same scrutiny." He paused. "I did try, years later when things had calmed down politically. I wrote so many letters." "I never received them," Eleanor said. "Never had any idea you were alive until your letter arrived 3 days ago." Nathan reached across the space between them to take her hand. His touch was warm, solid, real in a way Eleanor still couldn't quite believe. "We lost so much time," he said, his voice breaking slightly. Eleanor squeezed his hand. "We have now," she said, then hesitated. "Nathan, there's something I need to tell you about my situation." Thomas paced in his room, wondering what was happening below. The murmur of voices had been constant for nearly an hour, occasionally rising and falling in emotion, but never escalating to shouting or dissolving into prolonged silence. He jumped slightly when he heard his name called. Taking a deep breath, he descended the stairs and entered the library. Eleanor and Nathan sat close together on the sofa, their hands intertwined. Both had clearly been crying, but both also looked somehow lighter, as if a great weight had been lifted. "Thomas," Eleanor said with remarkable composure, "this is Nathan Winters." "Nathan, this is Thomas Webb, my husband." 3 days later, Thomas sat alone in a cafe across town, nursing a cooling cup of coffee. Eleanor and Nathan had been inseparable since their reunion. Thomas had given them space, spending more time on campus despite the whispers that still followed him. He told himself it was the right thing to do, that Eleanor deserved this unexpected gift of reconnecting with her lost love in her final months. He wasn't jealous, not in the romantic sense. His relationship with Eleanor had never been of that nature, but he felt displaced. For weeks, he had been her primary companion, the one she shared her thoughts and fears with. Now that role belonged to Nathan. "Penny, for your thoughts?" Thomas looked up to find Nathan standing beside his table, looking more energetic than he had the day he arrived. "Mind if I join you?" Nathan asked. Thomas gestured to the empty chair. "How did you find me?" "Eleanor mentioned you liked this place." Nathan settled himself with the careful movements of someone managing chronic pain. "Also, I wanted to talk to you alone." Nathan fixed Thomas with a penetrating gaze. "You're wondering where you fit now that I've appeared," he said directly. Thomas blinked, surprised by the man's perception. "Something like that." "Eleanor loves you, you know," Nathan said. "Not the way she loves me, but genuinely and deeply nonetheless." "I know," Thomas said quietly. "I care for her too." Nathan nodded. "This is an impossible situation for all of us. 2 dying old folks, and a young man caught in the middle." He smiled sadly. "If this were a poem, it would be beautiful in its tragedy. Living it is messier." Nathan leaned forward. "I have a proposal." "I'm listening," Thomas said. "I've also received a terminal diagnosis. Cardiac issues primarily. 6 months, maybe less." Nathan shrugged as if discussing the weather. "Neither Eleanor nor I have time to waste on conventional approaches. What are you suggesting? that the three of us tackle her list together." Nathan's eyes twinkled. "I may be old, but I've still got some adventure left in me. And I think, between us, we could give Eleanor an extraordinary final chapter." Thomas considered the unusual proposal. "You don't find our marriage strange, inappropriate?" Nathan laughed. A surprisingly robust sound. "Young man, I spent 40 years in exile for writing poetry that questioned authority. Conventional has never been my concern." His expression grew serious. "What matters is that you've made Eleanor happy. You've given her comfort when she needed it most. That makes you family in my book." Thomas felt something tight in his chest loosen. "So we just continue with the list, the three of us?" "With some adjustments," Nathan said. "Eleanor mentioned the Northern Lights are on her list. I've never seen them either. I think we should go to Iceland next week." Thomas's eyes widened. "Iceland. But Eleanor's health. We're both dying," Nathan said matter-of-factly. "Might as well do it while seeing something magnificent." As Nathan outlined his proposal, Thomas felt a new possibility opening before him. Not the quiet domestic final, months he'd envisioned with Eleanor, but something wilder, more expansive. A grand adventure with two extraordinary people who had defied convention their entire lives. "What do you think?" Nathan asked finally. Thomas smiled, making his decision. "I think we need to book 3 tickets to Iceland." The Northern Lights danced across the sky in ribbons of green and purple, reflecting off the snow and casting an otherworldly glow over the landscape. Thomas stood slightly apart from Eleanor and Nathan, giving them the private moment they deserved as they witnessed this natural wonder together. In the 3 months since Nathan's return, they had embarked on what Eleanor called their grand finale tour. Iceland for the Northern Lights, Paris, where Eleanor and Nathan finally visited the city they were supposed to flee to decades ago, a small village in Tuscany where Eleanor had always dreamed of writing poetry. Thomas had become their companion, their coordinator, and increasingly their caretaker. As both elders weakened, he managed medications, arranged for wheelchair assistance at airports, and ensured they had comfortable accommodations. As he watched them now, arms around each other beneath the dancing lights, he felt privileged to witness their extraordinary love story, interrupted for decades, but now continuing, as if those years were merely a brief intermission. 2 weeks later, back in the brownstone, Eleanor slipped away quietly in her sleep. Thomas found her in the morning, looking peaceful with a half-finished poem on the nightstand beside her. Nathan, when told, simply nodded and asked to be alone with her one last time. The funeral was small but distinguished. Literary figures from around the world sent tributes. Universities where Eleanor had taught lowered their flags. Former students spoke of her influence on their lives and work. Nathan delivered a eulogy that left no dry eyes in the chapel. He spoke not of Eleanor, the distinguished professor, but of Ellie, the passionate young woman who had believed poetry could change the world, and who had changed his world completely. After the service, Mr. Abernathy, Eleanor's lawyer, asked Thomas and Nathan to meet him at the brownstone the following day for the reading of the will. Thomas spent that night helping Nathan, whose health had declined rapidly since Eleanor's death, get settled in the guest room. "I won't be far behind her," Nathan said matter-of-factly as Thomas adjusted his pillows. "A few weeks, perhaps." The next morning, Mr. Abernathy revealed that Eleanor had divided her estate. Half would go to the establishment of a foundation for young writers, with a focus on poetry and political writing. The foundation was to be named the Blackwood Winters Literary Trust. The other half went to Thomas, with the specific instruction that a portion be used to establish an independent bookstore with a dedicated poetry space named the Eleanor Blackwood Poetry Sanctuary. Eleanor also specified that the Blackwood Winters Literary Trust was to be administered jointly by Nathan and Thomas. "There's also a letter for each of you," the lawyer said, handing them sealed envelopes. After the lawyer left, Thomas and Nathan shared their letters with each other. To Nathan, Eleanor had written of her enduring love, asking him to be gentle with himself, to help Thomas, and to finish his collection of poems. To Thomas, She wrote of her gratitude for his friendship and companionship, entrusting him with her legacy and reminding him that family is defined not by convention, but by choice. In the weeks that followed, Thomas and Nathan fell into a new routine. Mornings, they worked on foundation plans. Afternoons, Nathan wrote while Thomas sketched. Bookstore layouts. Evenings, they shared meals and stories about Eleanor. When Nathan followed Eleanor 3 months later, Thomas was beside him, holding his hand as the old poet recited his final verses. 1 year after Eleanor's death, Thomas stood in the newly renovated space that would become Blackwood Books. The Eleanor Blackwood Poetry Sanctuary occupied the back corner, a cozy space with comfortable chairs, excellent lighting, and shelves already filled with carefully selected volumes. As Thomas prepared for the bookstore's opening, which would coincide with the launch of the Blackwood Winters Literary Trust's inaugural Poetry Prize, he noticed a young woman examining the poetry section with unusual intensity. "Can I help you? Find something?" he asked. She looked up, slightly startled. "I'm looking for Nathan Winters' final collection. I heard it's extraordinary." As they continued talking, Thomas felt a familiar sensation, that rare connection that happens when kindred spirits meet. It reminded him of his first conversation with Eleanor, of watching her reunite with Nathan, of the unlikely family they had formed. Eleanor and Nathan were gone, but their legacy continued, in the bookstore, in the foundation, and in the connections that continued to form in the spaces they had created. Their unusual story had not ended with their deaths, but had simply entered a new chapter. Thomas had once been a quiet student who married a woman 3 times his age. A letter had changed everything. And now, standing in the bookstore that was both his dream and Eleanor's legacy, he understood that the change was still unfolding in ways none of them could have anticipated.
Life often presents us with unexpected connections that transform our journey in ways we could never predict. Thomas began as a quiet student seeking meaning, only to find it in an unconventional relationship with a woman 3 times his age. Their story reminds us that love and family aren't defined by conventional boundaries, but by the choices we make and the bonds we create. Perhaps in your own life, there's been a moment when everything changed, when a letter arrived, when a stranger became family, or when you faced an impossible choice that led to unexpected beauty. How did you respond to that moment? Did you embrace the unconventional path like Thomas, or do you wish you had? Share your story in the comments below. When has an unexpected connection changed everything for you? And remember to subscribe for more stories that explore the extraordinary moments that transform ordinary lives.